Okay, we are recording.
All right, good. So people are aware of it. All right, maybe I will kind of like say a few prefacing words at the beginning. We had actually a session on intelligent voluntary cooperation, which is the topic of the session, already at the last AGI strategy meeting. And so Christine, Mark, and I are currently writing a book on this topic. And because it pertains to AI in the sense that it is basically concerned with intelligence, and we used the last AI strategy meeting for a feedback session round. And now that the book is really in the process of being finished, we want to use this session to get much more feedback from you guys, because we think that the ideas that we lay out in the book are potentially a comprehensive alternative to many of the ideas that are floating around about AI risk right now. So we're hoping to get much more good feedback from you. And if you're interested in discussing the ideas that we'll be discussing in the session further, then please email me. I think I put my email up there in the session notes. Feel free to email me, and we will add you to our little book club group on this, and you can feedback on the book on the draft as it's coming out. All right, so I think we'll be having the Intelligent Voluntary Cooperation Slack group as well. So if you want to join that, then feel free. And we'll be note-taking on the collaborative notes doc. For your convenience, if you want to open that notes doc now, I already added a lot of notes on the general notes. So if you go on the spreadsheet right now, go into our session that is row 19, and if you there go on Intelligent Voluntary Cooperation, you should be able to find the notes, and we will basically be running through the notes. I will start off a little bit with some philosophical kind of like pointers in the book, and then Christine and Mark will kind of popcorn in and out on this one. That being said, if you want to note take, please feel free to just jot notes in. There's still a lot of space to write. Okay, before we start, maybe Christine and Mark, do you want to say a few words about kind of yourselves in relation to the book that we're writing?
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Christine. Christine, you're muted. Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Mark.
Okay. So when I was reading Bostrom's book, it kept talking about superintelligences as this brand new phenomenon, and it kept saying how we should not anthropomorphize it, and then it kept anthropomorphizing it. And the thing that just struck me was we've been dealing with superintelligences for a very, very long time, which are human organizations. We've seen in front of us this evolving superintelligence of human civilization as a whole. It met most of the criteria that Bostrom was writing down without Bostrom having that in mind. In fact, at some point in the book, he explicitly explains how it's not what he has in mind. But most of the history of human civilization involves how it is that we deal with these evolving human organizations, governments, corporations, etc., so as to better align them with human needs. And civilization as a whole right now is the vast increase in wealth over time, the vast decrease in violence over time, and the vast decrease in the number of people who are miserably poor over time shows that civilization.
I don't know if it's just me, but I can't hear you anymore, Mark.
Mark, we can't hear you.
Huh.
Can't
No,
hear
it's
you,
good.
Mark.
It's better now, I think.
Is it? Can you hear
Keep
me?
talking.
Hello?
Yes, you're back.
It's fixed.
Okay.
It's
What was the
fixed.
last
Keep
thing you
talking.
heard? What was the last thing you heard?
Back up about 2 cents.
Yes.
Okay. That much of the history of human politics and governance and social rules has been figuring out how to better align large systems of humans and the superintelligence that emerges from them, how to better align those with human interests. And civilization as a whole is now extraordinarily aligned when you take a look at it in terms of its overall metrics and how it compares with the past. It has come to be rapidly more well aligned with human interests over time. There's a rapid decrease in poverty, rapid increase in wealth, rapid decrease in violence. Our perspective is apply what works, learn those lessons, and continue to focus on civilization, trying to strengthen civilization, because civilization is now not just an intelligent system that is emergent from the intelligence of individual humans. It's now an intelligent system that's emerging from the intelligence of both human and machine intelligences. Machine intelligences are rapidly increasing in the fraction of their contribution to the overall problem-solving abilities of civilization. And the AI transition we're talking about is still one in which all of these separate intelligences, if things don't go bad, continue to be part of the emerging intelligence of civilization, and the dynamics of human interactions that causes that to work out well can be projected into a framework for the interactions between the the AI participants as well.
All right, that's quite a mouthful, and we're going to be unpacking that just in a second. Christine, do you want to say a few words about your background and how it's relevant to the book?
Yeah, just very briefly, just to agree with all of that, and to say that it's always seemed to me that a lot of the issues that we debate come down to security issues, both physical and computational security issues. And these have been of intense interest to Foresight and to me for decades. And also the principle, is there any way to apply the principles of the open society, of open source, to these very challenging problems? And those are the kind of issues we're exploring in the book.
All right, cool. Then what I'm going to do, for the next few minutes, I'm going to be walking you a little bit about the philosophy that underlies the book, and then we're going to unpack a few of the more practical lessons shortly after. So the book draft kind of arose from conversations that Mark, Christine, and I were having over the past few years, and it's based on the observation that if you look at individual existential risks, there are actually a lot of parallels between them. For AI, bio, and nano risks, there can be some common heuristics really that one could use to make civilization more anti-fragile, regardless of which of those risks we are actually facing. And we kept on coming back to those three words of intelligent voluntary cooperation over and over again in our discussion. And I gave a 10-minute summary talk, which is linked to from the collaborative notes doc. But I think, for the purposes of this discussion, let's focus not on all of the existential risks, but let's focus on AI for this one. And here, the kind of parallels that we see when we, I think about AI, as Mark was already alluding to, is that there really is a parallel between creating AI systems that are aligned with human values and between designing governance and institutional and interaction frameworks amongst humans that are aligned with human values. And one thing that I think really pops out at you right from the start is that one thing that is problematic if trying to align either AIs or institutions with human values is the fact that values differ a lot, right? And values differ a lot across humans. We see that once in the kind of like more shallow value divergence across different members of society, right? And across different societies. But we also see that much more deeply in philosophy, right? My background's in philosophy, and there really hasn't been any kind of like endpoint to the discussion of consequentialism versus deontology versus virtue ethics and so on. So values differ, and that the differing is real, and that is not only so right now, but we have values differ also a lot across history, right? So the second notion is that we have kind of continuously updated in different ways, but there has been an updating in valuing torturing versus valuing slavery, valuing our versus our valuing of women's rights. And while that is not always, I think, the same for everyone and for every culture in the same way, a few of us at least have been updating in similar directions. A few of us have been updating in divergent directions. But what's important here to note is that whatever we do, if we're creating an AI or if we're creating an institutional framework, that AI or institution will be around with us for a while. So it should also be dynamic and to be amenable to kind of like a progress or an updating in our values. And then finally, values also differ a lot across creatures. Values differ a lot across non-human animals and human animals. And in the future, as we're creating more capable AI systems that may or may not be sentient, they may differ a lot across those systems as well. So I think we want to be kind of like open in our approach to values. And I think this is a problem that is like the value differences are a problem that are faced by institutions, because institutions are trying to get people to coordinate that have very different value sets. And it's also a problem that we're facing in terms of AI, because in trying to align AIs with human values, we need to figure out what values to align an AI with. And there are actually a lot of common frameworks that have been proposed that are trying to handle value diversity and value plurality. One of them is Rawls' Veil of Ignorance, of course. And then one of them is, human rights. You could say another one of them is the framework of democracy. And actually, Ias and Gabriel from DeepMind published a paper recently, kind of like going through those frameworks to handle value plurality and seeing whether they can be used for AI systems and for creating AI governance mechanisms. And I think, those frameworks are all good. I won't be going into much detail on them now, but they're basically seeking to handle different entities with different values. And I think they are all like laudable attempts, but ultimately they're still somewhat suboptimal, because your preference over one versus another of those frameworks, or even your interpretation of one of those frameworks, still depends on your values. So what it means to be behind a veil of ignorance is still somewhat idiosyncratic to your current value sets. The same for human rights, and so on and so forth. So that is still kind of like ultimately leading to that values differ, and it's unclear which one is more legitimate versus another. So in a nutshell, we need kind of an AI or human interaction architectures that are legitimate in the face of reasonable value pluralism. And this is kind of like the philosophical the philosophical end of the discussion. Where it goes to action is like, okay, how would those decision architectures or such architectures that can handle AIs with different values, how would they actually look like? Well, I think no matter what your values are, I think you want to be doing two things that are, I think, universal enough to be applying to all valuing creatures. One is if our values differ from each other, we need to find a way to peacefully coexist in the face of values that differ. And so here we need, in order to do that, we need boundaries that make interactions voluntary. So at least at the minimum, we want kind of like to create an interaction architecture by which different creatures with very different values can still peacefully coexist with each other. That's number one. The second thing is, we don't only want to be coexisting with each other, we also want to cooperate when our values align, because actually they align a lot, right? This is how I think we can create many amazing things in civilization. So apart from just being able to peacefully coexist, we also want to actively seek out those opportunities for cooperation when our values align. So in a nutshell, this is the concept of voluntary cooperation. We want boundaries across which interactions must be voluntary, but then we also want to actively seek out more opportunities for cooperation when values align. And so this is kind of like that concept in a nutshell for humans, right? But it's not really only applicable to humans, because we could expand this framework to also include AIs, because like humans, AIs are goal-seeking creatures, and we don't usually call that having values, but still they're having goals. And in principle, at least, an interaction architecture that is truly value pluralistic could also be expanded to include AI goals, right? So this is kind of like in principle, and this would then be a framework of intelligent voluntary cooperation. So a framework that actually includes other intelligences as well. So that's all a mouthful, and this is kind of like the theory aspect of the book, but how that actually looks like in practice on the notes, that's the second page if you want to follow them along. It starts with how would intelligent voluntary cooperation look like in practice. I'll be going over this before I'll ask Christine and Mark to provide actually examples of how this may look like. If we first look at voluntary cooperation across humans, if we want to do voluntarism first, we have to think about what are the biggest threats to the ability of us to be able to engage voluntarily with each other. And the main threats is aggression via automated physical threats from, for example, lethal autonomous weapons, biorisk, nanorisk, and so on. And here we have the concept of multipolar active shields. And then we also want to have more cooperation on the other hand. And the way that we can get more cooperation across humans is by democratizing corporations. And here we're going to be talking in a sec about tools like from crypto commerce that are actually able to allow a lot more individuals to be collaborating much more cooperatively with each other. So let's table those for now. We're going to get back into the discussion in a sec. If we want to expand this to not only include humans, but also include AI creatures into this framework of voluntary cooperation, we need to think differently because with AIs, most of our interactions will be digital, right? They'll be online. So instead of worrying just about physical harms, we should be worried about cyber threats, or like in a nutshell, bad bits. And so the types of kind of defense mechanisms that we have to set up there must look different. So here, I think the main angle that we're focusing on is computer security. And then on the flip side, if we want to kind of like construct cooperation frameworks that include increasingly automated entities, then we also need to expand the ways in which we cooperate to include those entities. And here, Mark's decision alignment is a really good pointer to, and which we'll unpack in a second. But really, in a nutshell, as Mark has already said, if we want to kind of like draw some quick conclusions, the focus really of this book is that instead of trying to focus on creating AIs or institutions that seek to limit goal or value diversity, what we should be focusing more on is creating interaction architectures that actually allow cooperation across goal and value diversity. And the premise that Mark has already said is that in a nutshell, really civilization is already a super intelligence and it's already serving our interests by tending toward and facilitating more intelligent voluntary cooperation. And we should not try to replace this process or make it stupider, but we should try to focus on increasing the adaptive complexity that goes with it. So this is kind of like everything in theory. I would now love for you, if you are on the notes, we're now going to be taking a look at the point that I'm just highlighting on how would intelligent voluntary cooperation look like in practice. I think that's probably most interesting to many of you, but I think the theory, to know the theory is also important. But if we kind of go back to how would a framework of voluntary cooperation look like first, across humans? So how would we actually be able to defend against increasingly automated physical threats from lethal autonomous weapons, biorisks, and nanorisks? So here we are proposing the system of multipolar active shields to be able to better do that. And perhaps Mark or Christine, you would like to chime in on what do we mean by multipolar active shields?
So Allison, before, I'm going to turn that over to Mark, but before that, I just want to emphasize the point that it's a very simple, basic point, but it's kind of a fundamental point that we start from here, which is that when we're trying to think about AI risk and AGI risk in the future, probably the most useful analogy that we can use right now, and hopefully everybody has already thought of this and used it, is we already have superhuman entities in the world right now, and they already do bad things to us. These are mainly governments and very large corporations. And so rather than say, all right, we have to think completely orthogonally, there's absolutely no model in the world that we can use for thinking about this stuff. It's really, we have a place to start. And we can take the current situation and just project it into the future and say, all right, what if those entities that are already superhuman in their actions? What if they just continue to develop in that direction? And this can give us a way to come at this problem that is it's kind of different than I think the way most people are thinking about it in terms of especially technological risk. And I find it more useful and a better way to come at the problem. So with that as a very simple and obvious point, but something that I think is useful as a background, Mark, can you now jump in on the active shields?
Right. So the active shields, I have to, let me just say up front, I think the active shields is the most problematic part of our overall message. It's the hardest one, it's the most challenging one, and it's the one that, if gotten wrong, or if not done, either way, if we don't try and if we don't succeed, both of those have really terrible consequences. This is where we're talking about violence in the physical world. The very, very good news is that, as Steven Pinker documents, the actual degree of violence in the world has been decreasing amazingly, decreasing to the point where it's hard to understand how consistently and how strongly it's decreasing and why. But at the same time, the potential for amplified violence by a few small actors is also growing. So under the assumption that the vast majority of us in general see our interests as aligned with preserving the non-violence of our interaction with each other, and that there's the source of potential violent threats are few and far between, but can be amplified. What do we do about that? And the first thing is what we want to do about it wants to be an approach that doesn't make the situation worse. So one way to make the situation worse would be to turn over to create an institutional framework where there are centralized institutions that have an unchecked ability to impose violence on everyone else. If you look at Bostrom's writing about the fragile world hypothesis, it's basically vulnerable world hypothesis, thank you. It amplifies the problem because it purposely creates an institution that can't be controlled, that we've given the ability to perform violence on all of the rest of us, and which therefore is more likely to do so than the original problem we were scared about. The multipolar active shield idea is, I'll just sort of paint an idealized picture first, and then we can talk about the politics of getting there. The idealized picture would be that a open source effort with diversity and feedback between projects tries to create designs for systems that can be deployed, for robotic systems that can be deployed, that watch for and suppress signs of violence. And the key thing about the open source nature of it is that the deployment scenario you're trying to reach is one in which there are many separate deployments that are coordinated in the same way that the internet protocols were coordinated, which is that the open source effort has resulted in sort of loose agreement on standards, but the standards say what constitutes cooperative action within the framework, and then this multipolar deployment of robotic enforcement fabric is all watching each other as well, so that if somebody deploys a corrupted fabric and it starts to operate in a bad way, that the other deployments of this fabric can respond. Now, This sounds very, very dangerous. It is very dangerous. I'm really terrified. I have to say, I'm very terrified of even suggesting this direction because the idea of robotic enforcement has such incredible potential for abuse. However, that's not one, it is not one of the possible choices we have for our future to not have robotic enforcement. As more and more jobs become automated, the jobs that put people in harm's way, where the purpose of the job is to project force, because right now those activities put people in harm's way, that's going to be one of the earliest places that will get replaced with robotic alternatives when we can. And we're seeing a leading indicator of this in the military, and specifically in the military with regard to drones. So I think we need to be aware that there is a huge danger of turning over physical enforcement roles to robotic enforcements anyway. And we want that to be as diverse and decentralized and mutually watching, the watchers watching each other to control each other as possible.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting to note here is that usually what's kind of proposed in, for example, I think in Vulnerable World Hypothesis by Boston, but also in a few other works, is something like a top-down surveillance state that can closely monitor everyone. But there is an alternative to that, right? David Brin talked about it in Transparent Society as a surveillance state, in which also there's kind of like a bottom-up surveillance, but there are also cryptographic tools that we can be using to mutually watch each other in encrypted ways. And one cool thing to look at there is the NSA thin thread experiment in that regard. So we are trying to basically kind of like give another alternative to top-down surveillance that is usually hailed as the #1 thing to do if we're trying to monitor for risks like biorisk, nanorisk, and AI risks. We have more info on that in the book, but I think in the interest of moving on, this is just kind of like a soundbite of how could one do that? How could one establish voluntarism across humans? If we talk maybe like for 2 minutes or so about what are a few tools in the space of crypto commerce, Mark, that you see that could make us much better at cooperating. I'm thinking about assurance contracts and so on and so forth, but probably you're the expert here.
Yeah. So once we get away from the physical world, then everything looks much rosier, and I'm much more hopeful that we're proceeding in a good direction, and we can continue to proceed in a great direction and build tremendous cooperation. The thing to notice about our online interactions is that we can only send bits through the net, as we're doing right now. We can't project force through networks. And as our interactions with each other become less and less tied to the locations from which we're interacting, we're more and more interacting with each other more purely through the electronic voluntary only system. However, the fact that it's voluntary is not is only enabling for us to proceed to build a cooperative fabric. There are many collective action problems. This is another area where human society has evolved institutions over time that we can learn from to help create multi-way cooperative relationships that are answers to collective action problems. And now we have a vast new technology for doing that, which is the technology of smart contracting. A way to understand what a collective action dilemma is one where there's a divergence between a Nash equilibrium and a Pareto preferred state. Let me unpack that a little bit. A Nash equilibrium is one in which we're all in some particular equilibrium arrangement, and And any one of us trying to deviate from that equilibrium behavior gets punished, so that there's a restorative force, an incentive restorative force, pulling us back into the Nash equilibrium. The equilibrium is a dilemma if we can all agree that there's some other equilibrium that we would all prefer to this one, that there's some other state we would all like to move to, but we can't get there through individual decentralized action because of this restorative force. So a smart contract allows us to create designed arrangements that we can bind ourselves to, and that we can conditionally bind ourselves to, that when enacted might jointly bring us to the other state. Now, coming to agreement and binding in a smart contract can itself create collective action dilemmas. So it's not a magic solution that suddenly solves the problem, but it's an incredible new tool to help and a new framework for institutional evolution and discovery of how to use this problem to escape bad Nash equilibria.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and in the book, you know, we're talking about a few examples here about assurance contract and so on. But I think one thing to note is currently it's hard to imagine how this could work. But I think it was also really hard to imagine, you know, how you maybe have something like desktop publishing in a time when you had only like the printing press and or you had to go through to print shops in order to print whatever you wanted to print. As soon as desktop publishing became available, people were like, okay, well, what's the big deal here? Then people started publishing their own things. They used like a hell of a lot of Comic Sans fonts and whatnot. And it first looked terrible, but over time there was a whole industry created around it. And over time people just got better and better at using it. And now we have crazy templates like MailChimp. And so I think similar to that, you know, we can, if we get it right, kind of like expect a similar positive development in the creation of smart contract templates and making it much more usable even to the average user, if we make it so. All right,
Yeah.
So much for crypto commerce. I think maybe, let's say, in the interest of time, could you say a few ways on how, you know, how specifically about AI we can try to bind AI systems into this framework of intelligent voluntary cooperation, and what computer security and decision alignment have to offer us here?
So when I talk to people about AI dangers and what's so scary about them, and I ask them specifically, how does it start? Let's say that we have a bad AI, and you have this, you have this worry that this bad AI is going to take over the world, or you know, turn everybody into paper clips or whatever. Well, you know, this bad AI is a program running in a computer. No matter how smart it is, how does it actually do these things? And generally, a lot of the bad scenarios, not always, but a lot of the bad scenarios start with, well, it escapes into the net. And you know, it's basically, they start laying out the steps that we would normally consider to be cyber war. And that's correct, but the problem is not in the nature of AI. We're already well over the AI threshold needed to use the insecurity of our computer systems to bring down civilization. If you read you know, credible things about what a full-scale cyber war among capable actors would look like, we don't have our civilization on the other side of that. So the problem is not caused by AI. The problem is already here, and it's caused by the vast insecurity of the deployed systems. And this is itself an example of a bad Nash equilibrium, which is the reason why we've got so many insecure systems is because the extra effort required to build secure systems gets punished by the market under competitive pressures. The blockchain area, again, shows us a possible route around this, which is in this sector, because it's non-jurisdictional, there is no fallback to jurisdictional law to recover from attack. When people build insecure systems, hundreds of millions of dollars are lost overnight with no recourse, and this happens over and over again. So this is a new ecosystem where we have a chance to build a full stack from the foundations all the way out to the user that evolves under selective pressures, where insecure crap gets purged from the ecosystem very quickly, and the selective winners of that process are the secure systems. And those secure systems should remain secure in the face of artificial intelligence attackers. Because when somebody, for example, proves that some particular program is secure against a threat, there's no term in that proof that says, assuming the attacker is of limited intelligence. It's quantified over a, for all possible attackers, that is independent of the hypothetical intelligence of the attacker.
All right, great. I think I want to leave some time for questions as well. At the end, I think in terms of one thing that is interesting to note, and I think that could be also a really good way to kick off the Q&A and the discussion with others, is that this directly, like this worldview that we're kind of propagating in the book, right, and that we're laying out there is deeply decentralized, right? And it's a worldview that really seeks to improve on the adaptive complexity and problem solving of civilization. And now what we've seen in times of kind of like times when the world has proven vulnerable, just like now with COVID, right? I would like to have you say a few words about how can we be sure that such a bottom-up system is actually superior to one that is top-down? Because in the case of COVID, a lot of people have made the claim that actually the Chinese government has done quite a good job at kind of like implementing kind of like a top-down solution. And for the ones that want to follow the answers on why top-down may not be a good idea, that's on the notes on the second page at the bottom. But if Christine and Mark, you maybe want to kind of like elaborate on a few kind of problems of top-down solutions in the face of existential risk, for example, like COVID, and why bottom-up and decentralized solutions are better here.
Mark, you go ahead.
Actually, before either of us go ahead, do any of the other participants have any questions or comments or want to jump in? Okay, I'll go ahead. So first of all, I do want to compliment the Chinese government on how well they've done. I think we, for all the criticisms I'm about to mention, I don't want that to detract from the degree to which we should be admiring and grateful of the Chinese government for doing the things that have been effective at limiting the spread of COVID. Okay, with that said, in the US, we've also seen quite dramatically the failure of central planning and the suppression by our culture of central planning, specifically our culture of asking permission of actions, decentralized actions that could have saved millions of lives. And what I'm talking about is people feeling like they needed to get permission before they could deploy tests and before they could build and deploy ventilators or good masks and all of these things. It's really astonishing to me the degree to which the United States seems to have lost the spirit of civil disobedience against immoral laws. Back in the Spanish flu, regular people, tinkerers, we had a culture of tinkerers, but we had a culture in which people built iron lungs for polio. people built all the devices that needed to be deployed of the technology of the day to save lives. And it was a world in which nobody even imagined that they needed to ask anyone's permission to do that. In the computer world, we're also, I think, more used to civil disobedience than we are in the medical world. The crypto export controls of the 90s was broken largely by many actions of civil disobedience, making it clear that that was an unwinnable battle on the government's part. People should be building, so I think that the bottom-up actions, the decentralized actions that people would be taking in the absence of a culture of permission would be extraordinarily effective. We wouldn't have a ventilator shortage. We wouldn't have a shortage of masks. We wouldn't have a shortage of tests. We would have all of these things. And people who are self-isolating are not self-isolating because they're worried that they'll go to jail if they don't self-isolate. They're self-isolating for two reasons. One is their own fear that they might get infected, so therefore it's self-stabilizing. The incentives push them as if by an invisible hand to the right action to help save everybody else as well. And in addition, there's the moral, the moral message of please self-isolate so you're not contributing to endangering others. Both of these are powerful, and both of these are happening, and neither of them relies on central command. They just rely on good media for communicating messages and for clear information, so that credible messages dominate non-credible messages. And for that credibility to happen, those messages have to not bottleneck through central authorities that might well decide that they want to promote messages that are not true.
Sorry, can I just make a comment on that?
Please do.
Yeah, I think the concept of reputation has changed significantly over the past, I don't know, let's say 50, 100 years. There's an element where the days that you were talking about people getting out and doing things themselves, there was a very, very short connection between what that individual person did and the people in their the circle of knowledge who knew that person. That was effectively very highly reputationally based. People knew very quickly if that person was, for example, making dodgy stuff. But if we come forward to today's society, I think one of the dynamics that has driven us toward these kind of centralized certifiers that says, well, okay, they're able to do something, is in a response to reputation being much harder to track. That chain of connection between the person that's made something and the person that is then relying on it is not the person down the street or somebody that is a friend of a friend. It's a person who I will never know from some other corner of the country. So I'm just interested to hear how you kind of deal with that kind of problem.
In the presence, so I mean the lack of tracking, and the ability to make connections that are no longer based on physical proximity, I think we're in a tremendously good situation with the net and with modern cryptography, and the things like digital notaries, like blockchains, all enabled by digital signatures. We can create credible, uncensorable tracking systems that are undeniable in retrospect about who said, who made what claim when. And I think this gives us an ability to do, and our ability to gather statistics over large corpora of that tracking information and to use statistical reasoning to derive robust results, is all of this is tremendous compared to any previous state that we were in, and vastly exceeds the kind of centralized evidence building by centralized institutions that you're talking about, without introducing any monopoly on judgment.
Does that require us to get rid of pseudonymity?
No, no. It requires us to avoid impersonation. If I create a pseudonym and I create a signing key, a signing key pair, signature verification key and a signing key, and I don't reveal my signing key, then I've created a pseudonym. It's if I am careful enough, it's a pseudonym that can't be tied back to me, but you can't impersonate my pseudonym. And now my pseudonym can grow a reputation over time, and that's great.
I'm afraid that you mentioned the gains that were made by civil disobedience around cryptography, and I think that when you combine that with the level of pervasive surveillance, I think that it becomes somewhat untenable to maintain pseudonymity in the current state. Like, I'm not sure that you could achieve the level of civil disobedience you need for a healthy ecosystem in China today.
So I want to distinguish now between the two forms of pseudonymity, the two forms of civil disobedience that we're talking about. One is purely within the net, purely within the digital domain, and the pervasive surveillance that David Brin talks about, that it's essentially impossible, that where there's some degree of it that's in some sense inevitable, is not inside the net, is not in the digital domain. It's in the physical world. So the building and distributing of ventilators, that would be visible civil disobedience. That's not one where you could hide behind pseudonyms. But a lot of civil disobedience is effective. In fact, it was effective in the crypto space back then, because people doing the civil disobedience that broke the export controls were not hiding behind pseudonyms. They were wearing RSA t-shirts and going across borders, daring the police to arrest them, because that would turn it into a free speech matter. Zimmerman was under indictment for distributing PGP. People were using their names and engaging in prominent civil disobedience actions to make it clear that there was this collective moral revulsion against the export controls, and people were willing to suffer to overcome that revulsion. And I think that's what needs to happen with ventilators right now. I think we need to create a legal defense fund to help people who save lives with ventilators, who might get prosecuted for doing distributing an unapproved device or violating a patent. But I think that the moral revulsion to leaving people to die because something didn't get approved by the FDA is strong. In the digital domain, it's completely different. We're already in a non-violent situation purely within the digital domain, and a good pseudonym allows you to create a robust digital reputation such that the physical person behind the reputation cannot be punished cannot be coerced by physical means if nobody can trace the pseudonymous identity back to a physical human being.
I think where we are talking about, let's say, right-minded people doing generally accepted good things, certainly the whether it's the person is actually identified or whether they're adopting a pseudonym, it doesn't seem to make much difference. But if what we're concerned about is dealing with the wrongdoers in society, one of the problems with pseudonyms, wrongdoers.
Oh, wrongdoers. Okay,
wrongdoers,
sure.
yeah.
Okay.
Then in that case, the problem with pseudonymity, it seems to me, is that I can have many identities. Now, the examples that you gave, which are, let's call it physical world examples, part of the strength of what they were doing was saying, I'm here, I'm Søren Johnston, and I believe in this, and I'm going to go and do it. Now, if I happen to have pseudonymous identity A, and I'm plugging out something which is possibly causing damage, and that goes wrong, it doesn't come back to me, no problem, because then I can ship over now to my next identity and repeat. How do you kind of try to address the wrongdoers who are doing that?
So in the crypto world, sorry, when I say crypto, I mean cryptography in general. I don't mean specifically the blockchain world. But actually, in this case, I do mean the blockchain world. This is known as the Sybil attack problem, or the sock puppet problem. And it's essentially the problem of, you can think of it as, I think Dean Tribble coined the terms positive reputation system and negative reputation system. A negative reputation system is where every claimed identity starts off being something that you consider to have some degree of trust in, until they misbehave, in which case they acquire a negative reputation. And that's any such thing where simply each claimed identity gets an additional investment of somebody else's trust is vulnerable to Sybil attack. The flip side is that simply being an identity does not cause anyone else's taking of a risk on you, that all fresh identities start off with zero reputation, and it's only repeated good work or attachment of liability, i.e. The cost of proof of work or the cost of the risked capital with proof of stake, or any kind of bonding arrangement where you have, you've put up capital that gets sacrificed on bad behavior. Any of these kinds of arrangements will start to create a feedback loop where a pseudonymous identity can acquire a good reputation. And then once that iteration happens and that entity, that pseudonymous identity benefits by that good reputation, that itself is a capital asset that is at risk to their bad activity. So
right. Yeah, I think in the interest of time, we have to go back into the main room at 35, but I encourage everyone who's interested in discussing this more to email me, and then we will try to add you to a discussion group on the book draft. I think just now we finished like a chapter just in time, that's basically focusing on what are kind of like the risks of kind of top-down systems in those Exodus scenarios. We go through a single point of failures, then on ways in which it limits the intelligence that can be applied to a problem, in ways that it incentivizes even the search for those world-destroying technologies, creates the risk of internal and external abuse, and lastly, the transition risk and first strike instability that would be required in setting up top-down solutions. So I think, so far, and tying back kind of like the discussion on COVID and other risks back into the worry about top-down agents, whether they are AI or made of human institutions. Okay, if you're interested in any of this, then please join us by sending me an email. And with that being said, I'll see you in a second again in the main Zoom room for report out. So Mark and Christine, get ready and please stick to 3 minutes. Alrighty, I'll see you in a sec. Bye-bye. Thank you so much. And Christine, don't forget to close the recording. Christine, are you closing the recording?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good. Just so that we have